All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this edition of our summer webinar series, Understanding Warehouse Distribution Cost to Retail, presented by Colby Beland of K-Stack. Welcome, Colby.
Good morning.
The good news today is that we are on the tail end of summer, so hopefully it'll cool down in the next couple of weeks. But until then, let's talk some distribution. We here at Supplier Community really want to bring the experts to our audience, and man, no doubt you are the expert, Colby, so you have the proverbial floor, sir.
Thank you, Josh. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining the Supplier Community's WebEx today on understanding warehousing and distribution costs to retail. I'm honored that they have asked me to present to you today. I have spent the last 25 years working literally in every mode of the supply chain industry: parcel, LTL, full truckload, intermodal, warehousing, international, and even bulk commodity transport. The latter half of my career has specifically been focused on helping CPG suppliers into retail. Today, I intend to share with you many of the observations, both positive and negative, that I have witnessed suppliers make when they're developing their delivered costs to their retailers. It's pretty simple. If you're participating in this meeting today, you're likely involved in the retail vertical in some form or fashion, and therefore you know the consumer is the boss in the retail world. One of the biggest challenges for all of us today is that with the advancements in technology, the consumer is now more empowered than any time in history. As a result, consumers are forcing retailers, and therefore you, the suppliers, and your supply chain service providers to change the way you manage your businesses. What's intriguing to me is when I work with suppliers, I often have conversations about what their organizations are currently doing to keep up with the ever-changing retail landscape. And over the last few years, the conversations have been centered around how they're investing in, you name the buzzword, business intelligence, artificial intelligence, blockchain, business analytics, omni-channel distribution, e-commerce, the list goes on. Don't get me wrong, it is very important for companies to be focused on keeping up with the times, but it amazes me that the responses aren't more focused on the actual levers that they can immediately control within their supply chains. Suppliers that invest or focus on optimizing their supply chains can and will positively impact their bottom lines with their retail partners. Conversely, suppliers that fail to get a firm grasp on their supply chain costs face going out of business, or best case scenario, selling their product at break-even margins. Neither one of these are viable options to sustaining and growing your business with your retail partners. Whether you work in sales or supply chain, my goal today is to help you better understand and provide you with an awareness of the levers that your organizations need to clearly understand before your company provides a sales price to your retail partner. I hope this sounds of interest to you and would be a benefit. Now let's get started. So typically we see 5 common pricing mistakes made by suppliers. And this first one is the one that I love the most: guesstimating at supply chain costs. What do I mean by guesstimating? Many times there are suppliers that have this CFO or CEO that have this arbitrary number in their head that supply chain costs are some percentage of cost of goods sold. 6% to 10% is usually the range. And they don't spend a lot of time doing due diligence or analysis to truly understand what their supply chain costs are. And once you give your cost to your retail partner, you can't take it back, and you're stuck with that for some period of time. And as you know, it's very difficult to get price increases accepted by your retail partners. So guesstimating in thin air, pulling a number out of thin air, is never a good way of doing business. There is no magic number. There is no 6% or 10% or $1 per case or 50 cents a case or whatever it is, some cost per pound. It doesn't exist, and there's no perfect scenario. The other thing that is interesting about guesstimating is the belief that, the more volume that I have, the lower my costs are going to be. That is not always the case when you're talking about supply chain specifically. More does not always equate to a better price. It does in a lot of cases, but it doesn't always. So people that guesstimate are flawed in their analytics, and we see this like daily with suppliers when they're giving a retail partner. When we're talking with them, we say, "Well, how did you come up with that number?" "Oh, we just assume that it's $1 a case." Well, it leads me to my next point. When you just say it's $1 a case, you're not counting for all of the costs that are factored in. There are three primary buckets to supply chain costs. There's three pillars that you have to factor in. And inbound, that's inbound to your facility, inbound to your warehouse partners, inbound to the retailer. Then there's warehousing costs, and then there's outbound costs. And at the end of the day, we see suppliers that are heavily focused on their warehousing cost number. When you think about the three buckets, inbound, warehousing, and outbound, 2/3 is in transportation. Only 1/3 is in warehousing. Yet they get focused on the 1/3 and not the bigger spend, because a lot of suppliers don't allocate or account for the inbound cost, because they just assume it's an arbitrary cost that has to be accounted for coming in, and they don't include it. And what I mean by that is, if you're a supplier and your warehouse is in Chicago and the inbound's coming from Minneapolis from one co-packer and your other co-packer's in Dallas, Texas, your inbound costs are significantly different from Texas to Chicago versus Minneapolis to Chicago. So you have to factor in total inbound costs. And it amazes me how often suppliers do not include inbound costs when they're doing an analysis of how to develop a price to the retailer. They just, either they're misled or they believe that, inbound is inbound and I have to have it. But you have to account for all the costs. The other thing that typically doesn't get factored in is packaging and cube utilization in the supply chain, and the impact that packaging and cube have on your logistics costs. And making minor modifications or adjustments in your packaging can have severe transportation impact. The interesting thing is, most organizations are siloed. You have sales, you have marketing, you have operations, and sales and marketing aren't always on the same page. Marketing and logistics a lot of times are definitely not on the same page. What I mean by that is, marketing wants to take advantage of the packaging and the branding and the visibility of the product on the shelf. And that's great, and it's understood, but literally just taking an inch off or a half an inch off here or there throughout all of your different SKUs can impact your supply chain cost immensely. And therefore, really, marketing, sales, and supply chain all need to come together and have conversations about what their goals are and what they're trying to accomplish. At the end of the day, are your sales really going to be increased by having, call it, 5 cubic inches more of packaging on the shelf, when that spread across all of your shipments through an annualized year equate to significantly more pallets that have to be shipped and stored and handled throughout your supply chain? So the second biggest impact that we see is not accounting for all of the costs. And then one other cost driver that is really important is the impact that minimum charges have on your supply chain. In today's world of retailing, retailers want to order smaller quantities more often. So instead of ordering on a replenishment pattern of 1 time a week, they may want to order 2 times a week or 3 times a week. And that cuts down on your shipment sizes inbound to those retailers, which means you may be hitting a fixed minimum charge, and it's a fixed cost. So let's just say it's $50. If you're only shipping 10 cases, your cost per case can go up significantly if you're bumping up against a minimum charge. So as retail replenishment patterns change, it's very important for suppliers to adjust or change their pricing as their volumes and their replenishment patterns change. So in my opening statement, I said optimizing your supply chain. That's kind of a funny topic because everybody hopes and believes that their supply chain is optimized. And a lot of people say, well, I had a consultant, or we did an entire network study 3 years ago or 2 years ago. Well, most of you know just what has changed with the world's largest retailer in the last 2 years from a supply chain perspective, with on time and in full and different measures that they're holding you accountable to. And if you're not changing your cost as the environment changes or the market conditions change, you're behind the times, and it's impacting your margins. And we see this all the time with suppliers. We hear all the time, I'm not making the margin that I need to make. And they're not looking at the levers closely that they can very quickly impact by just adjusting or taking into account these cost drivers in the supply chain. So the next one is understanding that not all retailers are equal. And what I mean by that is, let's just talk about Walmart and Sam's for starters, right? Walmart has multiple supply chains. They have their high velocity supply chain, their regional distribution supply chain, their pharmacy supply chain, their direct import supply chain. But at the end of the day, the two main supply chains are either regional distribution or high velocity distribution. And you're talking 40 plus distribution centers in both of those supply chains. Sam's Club only has 18 distribution centers to service their stores. So you probably see it in your own data. A Sam's Club shipment is normally either a half a truck or a full truckload kind of volume, where Walmart is typically going to be much smaller volumes because it's being spread out over 42 DCs versus 18. And then when you take Target or Kroger, for example, Target has 25 DCs versus Walmart's 42 DCs versus Kroger's 4 main DCs. So if you think about Kroger, they have 4 main distribution centers, the Peyton's DCs that service the majority of their stores. They have more DCs than that, but 4 main DCs. So if you think about the order quantities that are going into 4 DCs versus 18 versus 25 versus 42, you can't come up with a cost that is, for all retailers, that is equal. If you believe that your cost per case to Walmart is the same as Kroger, is the same as Sam's Club, your margins are going to be impacted negatively. And it's something that we see all too often where, again, going back to that guesstimating, supply chain cost is 10% of whatever or 6% of whatever, then you're not taking into account that all retailers are not equal. Beyond this, the network and the supply chain of the retailers, you also have different payment terms, collect versus prepaid. You have different vendor compliance metrics. And those vendor compliance metrics impact your margins, right? But the compliance metrics for Walmart are different than the compliance metrics for Kroger, are different than the compliance metrics for Target, and versus different compliance metrics for Amazon. So again, not all retailers are equal, and therefore your price cannot be the same across all retailers. And if you aren't developing or analyzing your pricing strategies differently by retail, then you're significantly impacting margin. And there are numerous levers within the supply chain that impact each one of your different retailers' costs. The fourth measure would be using last year's data for this year's business. And what do I mean by that? Well, yes, last year's data is great for a baseline when factoring in a price for this year's business. But as you know, when you do a line review, your points of distribution change. Your store counts go up, your SKU counts go up or down, and your store counts go up or down. And so as your points of distribution change, so does your cost. And you need to understand what these levers are that impact your cost, and therefore, you need to be adjusting your costs accordingly and doing the analytics accordingly. And again, going back to our conversation about packaging, right? The packaging that you have this year may be different than the packaging that you have going into the next mod set. So if marketing has changed your packaging, number one, it's critical that you go in and change your item setup and your SKU spec information within, Retail Link, One World Sync, whatever platform where you're housing your item setups. It's critical that, number one, you keep track of it, but then number two, somebody is factoring in the impact that it has on your delivered cost to retail. Because either you've added cube or you've reduced cube, and that will impact your margins either positively or negatively, and it has to be accounted for. Yet we see time and time again that once an item setup is put into whatever retailer's platform, very few people change it. And the item setup that marketing has is sometimes different than the item setup that that sales has, and is sometimes different even from what operations or logistics has. And so that impacts your transportation costs, and they have to be factored in. So, and then the other thing that changes year over year is industry, right? I mean, so right now we're talking about, there's talks about recession, there's talks about tariffs, the impacts of tariffs and what they're having on our supply chain and our costs. And a year ago, it was capacity and people talking about, unprecedented capacity and rates being, increasing rapidly and people not being able to keep up and adjust, and it impacting their margins. So every year there's a cycle in the supply chain that impacts your costs. So utilizing last year's numbers or last year's data is not a realistic view for next year's costs. You need to understand the impact of what's happened with your sales, your store count, your points of distribution, your packaging, industry, and then modes or carriers. Throughout the course of the year, did you switch modes of transportation? Did you go from utilizing full truckload to leveraging intermodal to lower your transportation costs, or did you mode shift from LTL to a consolidator to mode shift and lower your cost and improve service? And then, as those adjustments change, so does your cost. So normally what we see is companies working in silos. Sales is doing sales, operations, logistics is doing their thing, and marketing is doing their thing. And really, when it comes to working on your retail costs, the one thing that has to happen is these departments have to come together and they have to communicate to develop a strategic cost that will not impact their margins and will help them grow their business. And then lastly, this is the one that really cracks me up, is everybody's looking for the easy button. Everybody wants the easy button. They want to go to their logistics providers and say, we just want you to give us a flat cost per case to deliver our goods. We want the easy button. Just tell me it's $1 a case, and I'm going to put that into my cost, and I'm going to quote my retailer. And I've got news for you. There's no such thing as the easy button in supply chain. I can give you a number that's rolled up and looks easy, but there's so many different levers, and we've been talking about these levers that impact cost, that if you go with the easy button, you're leaving money on the table somewhere. I'll give an example. So if you start out and you're shipping your product, let's just say you get a mod set test, your new supplier, and you get a test, and they give you the 6 West Coast DCs, Hermiston, Apple Valley, Red Bluff, etc. And you're shipping every week from Chicago to those 6 DCs. And at the next mod set, they give you, and you're doing it at a flat cost per case. We're just going to use $1 for simple math. You're shipping to those 6 West Coast DCs for $1 a case. That's the easy button that you went with, right? And the next mod set, they give you Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, Spring Valley, Illinois, and St. Joe, Missouri, in addition to your 6 West Coast DCs. Well, if you use the same price of $1 per case to go to Spring Valley and Beaver Dam as you do to go to Hermiston or Red Bluff, if you're paying your service provider that same price, you're leaving money on the table, because the cost to deliver to Spring Valley or Beaver Dam versus Hermiston or Apple Valley or Red Bluff, they're very different, right? So I get that it's easy and everybody wants the easy button, but it's not the best solution for you as a supplier to just come up with a fixed flat rate in your pricing analysis. It's easy, but it's not the right thing to do. And oh, by the way, when the assumptions change of your sales with the retailer, either your sales are going up or your sales are going down, that's going to impact your margin when you just have that flat rate and you're not adjusting based upon the volumes and the size of the shipments that you're shipping. And then, once again, retail patterns or replenishment patterns are changing. So if you base your price on $1 per case on an order write or an order review of 1 time per week, and the retailer switches you to 2 times per week or every day of the week, then your costs go up tremendously, and you're stuck with this flat dollar case, regardless of the size of the orders, right? So it's very important that when people in your companies are wanting to develop this price to give to a retailer, somebody has to say, wait a minute, this may not be the best solution for our company. It's kind of like going to McDonald's and buying a combo meal versus just getting what you want. So you go up to the window and you want to order a Big Mac and a Coke, and the Coke's on the $1 menu and the Big Mac's $2 and it costs you $3, but they sell you on a combo and it costs you $7, right? It's easy to say, oh yeah, I want the combo, but you're paying for stuff that you don't need ultimately, or may not want. And my recommendation is when somebody in your organization is looking for that easy button, just remind them there's no such thing as easy button, and the old saying that nothing in life is for free. So just keep that in mind as you're working within your organization's supply chains to understand the impact to your costs. The next thing that I want to talk about is vendor compliance. As you all know, the retail landscape has changed, and the expectations and the demands that the retailers have put on you continue to change. And this is something that impacts your cost. And you as a supplier have to leverage or balance cost versus service. And meeting your on-time and in-full requirements, or your ORAD or single-day arrival requirements, depending upon the retailer that you're working with. All these retailers have different acronyms. They all have different ways of being punitive and penalizing you with fines or penalties or chargebacks. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to balancing service versus cost. And these balances of power really have to be factored in to your retail costs. And again, going back to my comment that not all retailers are equal, and using your costs from last year, probably not a good thing for for determining your price to the retailer next year based upon these continuing vendor compliance changes. And we went from supply chain reliability to on time and in full, and all other retailers basically came out and either have ORAD or single day arrival or on, different acronyms, but they're basically, penalizing you for being late or early or being out of stock or lower quantities. So the other thing that is very simple for a supplier to follow is the retailer routing guide, and it will impact your costs. Not understanding who the approved carriers are and routing your freight with those approved carriers impacts your costs. So if your supply chain team is not looking closely at each individual retailer's routing guidelines, and depending upon what retailer you're working with, whether it be Walmart or Sam's Club or Target or Kroger or Walgreens or CVS or Home Depot or Lowe's or whoever it is, they each have a different routing guide. So if your transportation department says, yeah, we got a great rate with carrier A, yet carrier A is never the approved carrier at any of these retailers, it can be impacting you from a penalty perspective or a cost to service because you're sitting waiting at the gate paying accessorials and things that impact your margins. So vendor compliance is critical. Labeling is another aspect that continues to change, both the requirements that the retailers put on you as a supplier to keep up with labeling. Some retailers want special, either corrugate labeling or individual case labels that impact your cost. And it's interesting to me that when I talk to suppliers, these costs aren't being factored in to their delivered cost or their price. I'll use Target as an example. Target requires a case label. If you're shipping collect to Target, they require a case label on every case. Whereas if you're shipping prepaid, you don't have to have a case label. So if you're utilizing an outside company or even internally, your labor costs increase when you are a collect supplier to Target and you're having to put a case label on every case. Whereas if you're prepaid, you can eliminate that. So having an understanding internally with your finance team, your operations team of how do we want to go to market? What kind of payment terms do we want? Can be impacted by understanding the compliance metrics of each individual retailer. Again, going back to not all retailers are equal. These labeling requirements at Target are not the same as Walmart, and payment terms vary. They can impact your margins to do business with any particular retailer. So understanding each one of these buckets and the impact that it has on your supply chain costs are critical. Documentation requirements. Rite Aid is notorious for penalizing you hundreds of dollars if you don't have a packing slip on your pallet when it arrives. And that's not, if you have 2 pallets on a shipment, that's not having your packing slip on one pallet, that's having a packing slip on each pallet. And so understanding the documentation requirements that each individual retailer has for you is a cost driver that you have to understand and be aware of when you're determining your retail costs. Corrugate requirements. Some retailers require different burst strengths or cardboard corrugate classifications for you to ship into their distribution centers. And it could be because, like Target Collect is moving in a floor-loaded environment, meaning your product is not palletized, even if they picked it up from you that way. When it leaves their facility to their store, it's floor-loaded, kind of like a UPS or FedEx trailer, and their corrugate requirements may be different than another retailer's corrugate requirements to prevent damage. And so understanding your corrugate requirements by retailer can impact your costs. Same as pallet requirements. Does it have to be on CHEP? Does it have to be on a managed solution like IGPS, CHEP, or PICO? Or can it be on whitewood? And if it's on whitewood, can it be grade A or grade B? And if it comes in and the pallet is damaged, are they going to penalize or fine me or reject the load? And all of those things come to impact your supply chain costs. Ultimately, these are the three main things that are going to happen if you don't follow the above guidelines, right? Your shipments could be refused if it's on the wrong pallet, if you don't have the right corrugate, if you don't have the right labels, if you didn't use the right carrier, if you didn't meet the delivery window of on time and in full, you're early or late, they can potentially refuse the order completely, cancel the PO in the system, and ultimately that's going to equate to chargebacks or penalties for you, the supplier. And at the end of the day, all of those things transmit to out of stock issues. On shelf availability is a big word that everybody uses. Well, if your shipment gets refused or your PO gets canceled or you're late, you're out of stock on the shelf. Out of stock on the shelf equates to lost sales. And quite honestly, if these things are happening, shipments are being refused, you're having to manage a bunch of chargebacks, it impacts your labor utilization both, at your organization and at the retailer's organization. If you're spending a lot of time or you have a team managing chargebacks and penalties, there's a cost to that. Your cost to service those particular retailers go up. And again, these are factors that people need to understand when they're doing business. I talk all the time. There's good customers and there's bad customers. There's good business and there's bad business. Really, the only bad business is incorrectly priced business. If you price it correctly, there's no such thing as bad business. So, but the labor utilization is a factor. And if you don't have the labor to do or manage the chargebacks, the penalties, the vendor compliance metrics, that's where you look to an outside third party that has experience or capabilities to help you facilitate servicing your retailer at the highest service levels. So if you don't have the people internally to manage this process, there are plenty of companies out there that specialize or can help you facilitate servicing your retailers. And then the final thing that I want to talk about, here we are mid-August. Either you're currently in peak season or you're approaching peak season very quickly based upon the category that you're selling to. And so another thing that impacts supply chain costs is peak and how you manage peak. The first thing, about peak that I would say everybody should be doing is forecasting. At the end of the day, if you're able to forecast effectively and you have more lead time, at the end of the day, you're not going to have to pay either expedited or repositioning fees to get capacity that you need to meet your retail demands or your vendor compliance expectations. So it really comes down to forecasting and giving and working with your carriers and your service providers to have time built in to find a way to get capacity repositioned effectively, so you don't have to pay for either a repositioning fee or an expedited fee to get your freight delivered on time when it's end of the month, end of the quarter, and it's peak season, and capacity is tighter than it's ever been. The base premise of all of it is really being flexible and communicating. If shipping on a specific day of the week can impact what mode of carrier you're able to use, and will you be paying a premium for that mode of transportation, right? I mean, depending upon what your MABD date is, or your RAD date or your RDD date, depending on the retailer that you're shipping to, being flexible on that front end of when you actually have the carrier pick up and ship can determine the mode of transportation. Is it intermodal? Is it full truckload? Is it LTL? Is it expedited? And are you paying a premium, or are you just going to pay the normal rate? So every time that you have to pay a premium, it's impacting your margins. And peak season is one of those things that needs to be a part of your pricing plan when you're working on your price to retail, especially if you're a seasonal supplier. If your volume is seasonal during peak, your costs are going to typically, your supply chain costs are typically going to be higher. So, If you're developing your supply chain costs at the beginning of the year or after peak season, and you're not thinking about those things when you're working on your budget, then again, coming up with that guesstimation or that easy button of $1 per case, that ultimately can come back to bite you for 2 or 3 months out of the year, where it may mean you making your bonus or you're not making your bonus because of your margin impacts. Can't say it enough. Working with a proven provider, somebody that can get you the capacity, and when you order that truck or that mode of transportation, intermodal can, LTL carrier to come pick up, whoever it is, utilizing best-in-class providers during peak season ensures that you're going to have the capacity that you need. And then evaluating a multimodal strategy. And at the end of the day, you may not be able to ship the normal mode of transportation that you need to meet the service expectations of your retail partner. And understanding that you may have to shift during peak season from intermodal to full truckload or full truckload to LTL because they're out of stocks and they need product more frequently. So they're ordering, again, smaller quantities more often, and you're going from LTL or from full truckload to LTL. And understanding those cost impacts. And is there a way to even mode shift from LTL to consolidate? There's so many factors that come into play, but if your supply chain team does not have a multimodal strategy in place, you're going to miss out. And then finally, the last one is your supply chain team should be working with the carriers to understand freight balance. And what do I mean by that? Well, during peak season, you have all of this product going into major cities across the country: Chicago, Dallas, New York, Miami, LA, wherever it's going. So you have this dense population of people. You have all this product going in and not necessarily anything coming out. So if your supply chain team is able to work with the carriers to find freight out of those markets to help them reposition their equipment back to where it needs to be and help them maintain their freight balance, that normally translates to cost savings for your company. So understanding that during peak impacts the equipment utilization of carriers across the entire United States. And if you have a strategy to work with your carrier, whether it's intermodal, full truckload, LTL, of, hey, where do you need freight and what do I have available, and work with your partner to give them those loads to reposition, it does a lot of things. It can help you in the short term, but it can also help you in the long term, and even more specifically, next year during peak, they'll remember that you had that relationship with them and you worked with them to help them balance their network. And when you're doing price negotiations, when your supply chain team is working on price negotiations, it will help. So that is at a very high level. I could honestly sit here and talk for the next 3 days, drilling down into each individual topic. But at a high level, these are the key things that we see time and time again suppliers continue to make when they're developing a price to a retailer. And the most frustrating thing is when they come to you and they say, we gave this price and now we're not making any money and we need you to get to this price. And you look at the data and we analyze the data and there's nothing you can do here. There's the order patterns, the replenishment patterns, the size of the orders, the factors, the assumptions that you use to develop your cost to the retailer aren't viable. They're inadequate. And as a result, they're going to impact your margins. And so it's what I wanted to share with you guys today. At this time, I'm going to open it up to questions and answers for you.
If you do have a question, feel free to use the messenger application on the right side of the screen. You can message the question to me or just publicly, and I will ask the question to Colby over the mic. Our first question is, You mentioned not going with the easy button. When someone is working with a retailer, why would they want to avoid going with the easy button?
Well, that's a great question. Again, at the end of the day, there's no such thing as an easy button. There are so many levers, and I didn't even cover half of them today, that individually impact your costs. And if you make the assumption, or you use the analogy that my cost is the same today as it is tomorrow, it's the same with this retailer as it is with another retailer, you're mistaken. And any company that adopts or utilizes that pricing strategy, they may have enough margin in it that they get by and they survive. But in today's world, as the retail pressures to continue to squeeze brands because of private label and because of omni-channel distribution and all the different levers in the supply chain that are impacting a supplier, if a supplier is not taking the approach, and I don't care if you're a small little guy or you're a Fortune 100 company, these levers exist in any supply chain. And it's very important that companies start focusing and understanding that the retail landscape has changed, and the levers that you can control, you have to hone in and focus on them and truly understand the cost of each one of those, so you can develop a cost that is unique to Walmart, to Sam's Club, to Target, to Kroger, to Amazon, because they're all different. And we see so many companies just say, use this simple number, or use this simple percentage, or whatever it is. And then 6 months later, 3 months later, a year later, they're crying because they can't get a price increase from their retail partner, and their margins aren't what they thought they were either going to be. They're either lower than they thought, or they're negative, and they're in trouble. And that's not a viable way to grow and maintain, profitable business and to be successful in the business world. So, for anyone that wants the easy button, I understand it. I'd love to be able to hit the Staples easy button on my desk every day, but it makes me feel good when I hit it, but it doesn't really work. It doesn't do anything when I hit that button other than say it's easy, right? So I strongly recommend digging in, peeling back, and drilling down to these levers. And if you don't know what they are, or you don't understand them, or we work with a lot of companies that are sales and marketing companies that outsource supply chain because they're good at what they do, and they know that they don't have the resources, the bandwidth, or the capacity to focus on supply chain and vendor compliance. And so at the end of the day, know that there are service providers out there that can help you, typically, for no cost, help you get a real cost that you can deliver to the retailer that is legitimate based upon the way that retailer is going to order. Again, the order quantity size, or the economic order pattern that you have, the EOQ that you have set up with Walmart, is going to be different than what you have set up with Target, and they need to be different costs that you're going to present to them. And it's amazing how often we see time and time again those factors aren't factored in, and then they want us, as their service provider, to help help them lower their costs. And there's really nothing we can do sometimes because the price they gave is just not realistic. They use the assumption of full pallet in and full pallet out from a sales perspective, yet Walmart's ordering 10 cases a week to each DC. And, they got 100 cases per pallet. Well, to ship 100 cases per pallet versus 10 cases per pallet, your costs are different, significantly different. And therefore, you can get in trouble if you try to use that flat number across the board for all retailers, and you don't have that cost per case figured out, the levers that drive Walmart versus Target versus Amazon. So I understand wanting the easy button, but in my opinion, I've seen it too often. It's normally going to come back to bite you.
And experience really is the best teacher in things like this. Does anybody else have any questions for Colby while we have him on the line here with us? Okay. Well, Colby, thank you so much for bringing your expertise and your years of experience to us today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to share the knowledge with our audience.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks to the supplier community, and thanks to everyone that joined today.
All right, we got some great stuff coming up, folks. Our next webinar is on Wednesday, August 28th. It's how to automate shipping carrier freight claims processing. In this webinar, you will learn how technology can be used to process more than 25,000 shipping claims per day, permanently solve your freight claim struggles for good through this free webinar. Then we've got our Ecom Collabathon coming up on September 12th in Rogers. That's at One Stone, and that's a collaborative working environment where you can work out any issues or questions you may have with our experts. And then, of course, our big signature event coming up is Winning on Amazon Beyond. That's October 15th in Springdale, all about optimizing any sales you may do on Amazon. So thank you to everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you again for our next installment of the summer webinar series. Thanks and have a great day.